She opened her gate to a silent wolf, unaware his silence was the price of a broken royal oath. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Evelyn Carter noticed the cold before she noticed him, the kind of cold that pressed against the skin like a held breath, the kind that made the old sensors along her perimeter fence click and hesitate, as if unsure whether to keep working or finally give up. The gate to her homestead stood at the edge of the valley, a broad arc of weathered alloy scarred by years of wind and dust, and beyond it the plains rolled out in pale silver under a sky washed thin by ion clouds. She had lived alone out here for almost 7 years, long enough to recognize every sound the land made at night, long enough to trust her instincts more than any early warning system. That was why she felt it before she saw it, the weight of another presence standing just outside the reach of her lights. Evelyn wrapped her jacket tighter, the fabric humming faintly as it adjusted to the temperature, and stepped onto the porch. The floodlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the ground, and there he was. He stood just beyond the gate, tall and still, his outline sharp against the drifting haze, as if he had been placed there rather than arriving under his own power. His armor was a muted gray, dulled by travel and weather, marked with shallow lines where insignia had once been removed. No weapon was raised. No signal was sent. He did not even shift his weight when the lights found him. He simply waited. Evelyn's heart beat a little faster, not from fear exactly, but from the familiar tension of choice. Out here, choice was everything. She could close the lights, retreat inside, and let the cold do what the cold always did. That was the safer option, the one the manuals recommended, the one every sensible voice whispered when the universe presented you with something unknown. Instead, she studied his hands. They were empty. One rested at his side. The other held nothing at all, fingers relaxed, palm open. She glanced at the display near the door, reading scrolling in steady green lines. No weapons charge, no active transmitters, nothing that screamed threat. The wind picked up, carrying a low sound across the valley. Not a growl, not a warning, just the hollow tone of air moving through stone. The man beyond the gate did not react. His helmet was off, revealing pale skin drawn tight by fatigue, eyes forward but unfocused, as if he were looking past her to something much farther away. Evelyn realized then that he was silent by more than habit. There was a deliberate stillness about him, a restraint that felt practiced, earned, and heavy. She placed her hand on the gate control and paused, the mechanism warm beneath her palm. "You can come in," she said softly, unsure why she spoke when he had not. Her voice sounded small in the open air. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with slow care, he bent and placed a long blade on the ground at his feet, stepping back from it, as if even the memory of holding it no longer belonged to him. He straightened and waited again, eyes lifting to meet hers at last. Evelyn swallowed and pressed the control. The gate opened with a low hum, light spilling across the threshold, and as the silent stranger stepped forward into its glow, she had no way of knowing that his silence was not a lack of words, but the cost of a promise broken in service of something greater than a crown. Evelyn led him inside without another word, the gate sealing behind them with a soft mechanical sigh that sounded almost like relief, and the warmth of the interior hit him a second later, not as a shock, but as a gradual easing, like muscles finally allowed to rest after being held too long. The main room was simple and clean, lit by amber panels that mimicked firelight without smoke or flame, the air carrying the faint scent of brewed coffee and recycled wood. She gestured toward a bench near the heat exchanger, its surface worn smooth by years of use, and he moved to it. With measured steps, as if every motion had been carefully negotiated long before tonight. He did not remove his armor at first, only rested his hands on his knees and lowered his head a fraction, eyes tracking the floor, the silence around him thick, but not empty. Evelyn busied herself at the counter, filling a metal cup with water, checking the temperature readout out of habit more than necessity, her mind working through a quiet inventory of details the way it always did when something unfamiliar entered her space. He was tall, taller than most humans she had met out here, but there was no tension in him, no coiled readiness, only a restrained patience that made her think of someone waiting for a verdict they already expected. She set the cup down within his reach and stepped back, giving him space, and he acknowledged the gesture with a slow nod, lifting the cup carefully, as though the simple act required intention. He drank without haste, each swallow deliberate, and when he finished, he placed the cup back exactly where it had been, aligning it with the faint scratch on the counter's edge. Evelyn noticed that too. She always noticed things like that. Outside, the wind rose and fell, rattling against the structure, but inside the sound softened, filtered into something distant and manageable. She leaned against the wall, arms crossed loosely, studying him in the quiet. "You can stay until morning," she said, keeping her tone neutral, practical, the way people did when they were offering something important but did not want to make it heavier than it already was. "After that, we will see." He looked up then, meeting her eyes fully, and for a brief moment she thought he might speak, the muscles in his jaw shifting as if testing a memory, but the sound never came. Instead, he reached to his chest and touched the bare place where a symbol might have been, fingers lingering there before dropping back to his side. The gesture carried weight, not explanation but acknowledgement, and Evelyn felt something settle between them, an understanding built without language. She turned to the small storage unit and pulled out a folded blanket, the fabric thick and practical, patched in places where it had been repaired more than once. She handed it to him, and this time he hesitated, eyes flicking from the blanket to her face, as if uncertain whether he was allowed to accept such a thing. When he finally did, his grip tightened just slightly, knuckles whitening before he forced his hands to relax. He stood when she indicated the adjoining room, sparse but warm, and paused at the threshold, glancing back at her one last time. He inclined his head, deeper than before, a gesture that felt formal, old, and burdened with rules she did not know. As he stepped inside and the door slid closed behind him, Evelyn remained where she was, listening to the steady hum of the station, aware that her quiet life at the edge of nowhere had shifted in a way that could not be undone, all because she had opened a gate and chosen not to ask why. Morning arrived without ceremony, the kind that crept in through filtered panels and quiet system chimes rather than sunlight, and Evelyn woke to the soft realization that she was not alone in her routines anymore. She moved through the station checking gauges and seals, the air temperature steady at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, the water recycler humming at its usual pace, everything normal enough to be unsettling. When she passed the adjoining room, the door was open, the bed neatly made, the blanket folded with careful precision, edges aligned, as if measured. He stood near the viewport, armor partially removed now, set aside in orderly pieces on the floor, his posture straight but unguarded, eyes fixed on the pale stretch of land beyond the glass. He turned when he sensed her, offering a brief nod, and she noticed how the morning light softened the lines of fatigue on his face without erasing them. She set a plate on the small table, simple food prepared the way she always did, practical and warm, and slid it toward him without comment. He accepted it after a moment, sitting only when she did, as though following an invisible protocol. He ate slowly, tasting each bite, and when he finished he rested his hands flat on the table, waiting. Evelyn took a breath. "I will need to check the outer sensors today," she said, keeping her voice casual. "Storm interference last night." He inclined his head, then gestured toward the door and back to himself, a silent question framed in movement rather than words. She hesitated, considering the risks she had. Learned to weigh instinctively, then nodded once. "You can come," she replied. "But stay close." Outside, the air was sharp and clean, the sky clearing to a washed blue as the ion clouds drifted east. They walked along the fence line, gravel crunching under their boots, the land stretching wide and empty in a way that made secrets feel exposed. Evelyn knelt by a sensor post, tapping the casing, reading the data stream, and when she glanced up he was watching the horizon, shoulders squared, attention focused outward with a vigilance that spoke of long habit. A distant hum passed overhead, faint but distinct, and she froze, recognizing the sound pattern immediately. Patrol traffic. He heard it too. His jaw tightened, eyes narrowing, and for a split second his hand moved toward where his blade would have been, then stopped, fingers curling back into his palm as if burned by the impulse. He exhaled slowly and stepped back, placing himself behind her without touching her, a deliberate choice that did not go unnoticed. The hum faded, the sky empty again, and Evelyn rose to her feet, turning to face him. "You are being hunted," she said quietly, not as an accusation but a statement of fact. He met her gaze, and after a moment nodded. Then, with careful clarity, he drew a small symbol in the dust with his boot, a broken circle intersected by a single line, and tapped his throat once. Evelyn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. "An oath," she murmured, understanding dawning slowly. He closed his eyes, just briefly, and the weight in that simple gesture told her more than any confession could have. As they walked back toward the station, she realized the choice she had made the night before was not a single act, but the beginning of many, each one measured not by safety, but by the quiet recognition of another being's worth, and she wondered what kind of world required silence as the price of honor. Evelyn did not sleep much that night, not because of fear, but because her thoughts kept circling the same quiet center, the image of a man trained for command, choosing restraint with every breath. And when dawn settled in again, she found him already awake, seated at the small work table, his attention fixed on a disassembled sensor module she had left there the night before. He had not powered it on, had not altered a single setting, but the pieces were laid out in a pattern that made the flaw obvious. The interference node misaligned by less than a quarter inch, enough to cause false readings during storms. She stopped in the doorway, watching him work without touching, diagnosing by sight alone, and something in her chest loosened. She crossed the room and slid a fresh cup of coffee toward him, the steam rising in a thin, steady line. He looked up, surprised, then nodded his thanks and took one careful sip, eyes closing briefly as if committing the sensation to memory. She pointed at the module. "Can you fix it?" He considered the question, then shook his head once and lifted a finger, pointing to the tool rack and then to her. "You can," the gesture said. "I will guide." Evelyn almost smiled. They spent the morning side by side, her hands following his indications, his movements precise and restrained, never reaching over her, never assuming control, only offering direction when she hesitated. When the sensor came back online and the data stream stabilized, she felt an unexpected swell of pride that had nothing to do with the machine. Outside, the day warmed to a mild 75 degrees, the wind easing into something gentle, and for a while the world felt smaller, manageable. It did not last. Midday alerts chimed softly, not alarms, just status changes, and Evelyn checked the display, her brow furrowing as she read the updated traffic projections. Increased patrol density. Not close yet, but closer than before. She met his gaze across the room, and he understood immediately, standing and stepping back as if preparing to leave before she could say the words. "You do not have to go," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Not yet." He hesitated, conflict visible in the tension of his shoulders, then slowly lowered himself back onto the bench. He reached for a scrap of paper and drew again, this time a line extending beyond the broken circle, splitting into many paths. "Danger spreads," the image suggested. "Staying endangers you." Evelyn studied the drawing, then took the paper and folded it carefully, placing it in her pocket. "So does living alone out here," she replied. "I made peace with risk a long time ago." He watched her, searching her face for uncertainty, finding none, and something in his expression shifted, a subtle change like a knot loosening. As evening fell, they shared a quiet meal, the station lights dimming to their night cycle, and when the distant hum of patrol engines brushed the edge of her sensors again, he did not retreat or reach for a weapon that was not there. Instead, he stood near the door, posture steady, placing himself between her and the outside without a word. Evelyn realized then that protection did not always announce itself, that sometimes it arrived in silence, measured and chosen, and as she looked at the man who had given up his voice to keep his honor intact, she understood that whatever oath he had broken, whatever crown had condemned him, the principles that guided him were still very much alive, and they were now standing quietly in her home. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Evelyn had not realized she missed, one shaped by shared silence rather than solitude, and she found herself measuring time not by alarms, but by the subtle markers of another presence moving through her space. He rose before her every morning, never waking her, and by the time she stepped into the main room the work table would already be cleared, the tools aligned, the sensors checked without being altered, as if he understood the difference between assistance and intrusion. She began to leave small tasks unfinished on purpose, a loose panel here, a misaligned conduit there, and each time he noticed, each time he guided her with a glance or a simple motion of his hand, his restraint more striking than any display of skill. Outside, patrol traffic increased in frequency, the sensor display showing faint arcs of movement along the edges of her territory, and with each update, she felt the tension tighten like a wire drawn slowly taut. He noticed that too. When the readings grew closer, he would stand near the viewport, scanning the land with quiet intensity, memorizing patterns, choosing positions that kept him between the station and the unseen eyes beyond it. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the valley in muted gold, Evelyn finally asked the question that had been pressing against her thoughts for days. "If they find you," she said, keeping her voice steady, "what happens?" He did not answer right away. Instead, he reached for a small slate she used for notes and drew carefully, the stylus moving with deliberate precision. He sketched a crown, simple and stark, then beneath it a figure kneeling, hands bound not by chains but by a line drawn across the throat. He tapped the line once, then crossed out the crown. Evelyn felt the meaning settle heavily between them. "You broke your oath to the crown," she said quietly. He nodded. "But you kept something else," she added, more to herself than to him. His eyes lifted to meet hers, and in that moment she saw gratitude there, not for shelter or safety, but for being understood without being forced to speak. That night, a storm rolled in, not violent but persistent, rain striking the roof in steady patterns, the wind pressing low against the walls. Power flickered once, then stabilized, and Evelyn lit a small auxiliary lamp, its warm glow filling the room. They sat across from each other, the silence no longer heavy but companionable, and she realized how much she had learned about him without a single word being exchanged, his discipline, his patience, his unwavering adherence to rules even when those rules had cost him everything. When a proximity alert chimed softly near midnight, closer than before, he rose immediately, shaking his head and gesturing toward the rear exit, offering to leave before she could object. Evelyn stood as well, placing herself directly in his path. "No," she said simply. "This is my home." He froze, conflict written plainly across his face, and for the first time she saw the depth of the choice he faced, not between safety and danger, but between isolation and trust. Slowly, he lowered his head, accepting her decision even though it went against every instinct he carried. The alert passed, the patrol shifting course without stopping, and as the quiet returned, Evelyn felt something settle into place, an understanding that whatever lay ahead, it would not be faced alone. In the stillness that followed, she realized that silence could be more than punishment, that in the space where words were forbidden, intent and loyalty could speak louder. And as she looked at the man who had given up his voice rather than betray his principles, she knew that opening her gate had changed not only his fate, but her own. The tension finally surfaced not as fear but as truth, arriving on a quiet afternoon when the sky was clear and the patrol readings held steady just beyond the threshold of concern, and Evelyn realized that waiting for danger to force decisions was its own kind of surrender. She stood at the central console reviewing maps, long-range scans, and outdated jurisdiction lines, and when she turned, she found him watching her with the same attentive patience he brought to everything, as if he already sensed the shift. "They are not going to stop looking," she said calmly, "and hiding forever is not a plan." He listened without interruption, hands clasped loosely behind his back, posture straight but receptive, and when she finished, he nodded once, acknowledging the weight of what she was saying even if he could not answer aloud. She brought up an old diplomatic channel, one she had kept dormant since leaving her previous post, its authorization code still valid though rarely used, and the console hummed as it established a low-priority link. He stiffened immediately, stepping forward and shaking his head, one hand lifting in a firm, unmistakable refusal. She met his gaze and did not back down. "I am not calling to report you," she said evenly. "I am calling to ask questions." He hesitated, conflict flickering across his face, then slowly lowered his hand, conceding not out of agreement, but trust. The channel connected to an automated relay, its neutral tone requesting identification, and Evelyn provided it without hesitation, her voice steady as she inquired about historical cases of royal oaths broken for non-treasonous reasons, about punishments that involved silence rather than execution or exile alone. The system responded with data fragments, references to ancient codes, to warrior castes bound by vows that placed the protection of innocence above loyalty to rulers. And as the information scrolled, she saw his shoulders tense, recognition clear in every line of his body. She turned the display so he could see, pointing to a specific clause, one that outlined an exception rarely invoked, a provision for restoration not of rank but of honor, contingent on testimony from a neutral party. "A witness," she said quietly. "Someone outside the crown." His breath caught, a sharp intake he could not quite suppress, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something like hope flicker across his expression, fragile and dangerous. He reached for the slate again, writing slowly, the words careful and deliberate despite the effort it clearly took. "They will not listen," he wrote. She read it and shook her head. "They might not," she agreed. "But silence is only a punishment if no one challenges it." The hours that followed were filled with preparation, not for conflict but for clarity, organizing records, reconstructing timelines, assembling a narrative built not on accusation but on principle. He assisted where he could, sorting data, indicating moments that mattered with a tap of his finger, never embellishing, never exaggerating, his commitment to truth absolute. As night fell, the station lights dimmed and the world beyond the walls grew quiet, and Evelyn realized the choice she was making was no longer just about offering shelter, but about standing beside someone whose silence had been demanded by power and choosing instead to give it meaning. When they finally paused, the air between them felt charged, not with fear, but with resolve. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and placed his hand over his heart in a gesture she recognized as gratitude and warning combined. She returned the gesture without thinking, mirroring his movement, and in that shared moment of understanding, Evelyn knew that whatever came next, whatever consequences followed, she would not regret opening her gate or her voice to speak where his had been taken, because some oaths were worth breaking if the cost was refusing to stay silent in the face of quiet injustice. The decision became real the moment the message left the station, not dramatic but irrevocable, a quiet transmission routed through neutral channels and archived systems that could not be unsent, and Evelyn felt the weight of it settle into her shoulders as the console confirmed receipt. He stood beside her, still and attentive, eyes on the scrolling confirmation as if memorizing each character, and when the system chimed completion, he closed his eyes for a brief second, steadying himself. The patrol presence shifted within hours, not rushing in but adjusting, patterns tightening, arcs narrowing around the valley like a careful hand closing rather than a fist. Evelyn watched the sensors and felt the old instinct rise, the one that said to pack essentials, to plan an exit, to stay ahead of consequences, but she pushed it down and stayed where she was. He sensed her tension and moved closer, not touching, simply aligning himself with her line of sight, a quiet reassurance offered without claim. As dusk approached, a single vessel appeared at the edge of sensor range, its signature unmistakably official yet restrained, broadcasting a request rather than a demand. Evelyn took a breath and opened the channel. The voice that answered was measured and neutral, requesting confirmation of identity and purpose, and she responded with equal calm, stating her name, her status, and her role as an independent witness, invoking an ancient clause few remembered and fewer respected. Silence followed, not the empty kind but the kind filled with evaluation, and she felt his presence beside her grow taut, the cost of this moment written in every line of his posture. When the response came, it was not permission or refusal but a directive to present evidence and testimony in person, under observation but without detention, a compromise that spoke volumes about the tension behind the words. Evelyn agreed without hesitation. The vessel settled on the plain at a respectful distance, lights low, engines idling, and as the ramp lowered she realized this was the point of no return, not for him, but for her as well. He turned to her then, lifting his hands in a gesture that was half apology, half farewell, the slate already in his grasp. He wrote quickly, urgency clear in the firm strokes. "You do not have to do this." She read the words and shook her head, placing her hand over the slate to still it. "I do," she said softly, "because silence only works when everyone agrees to it." They walked together toward the vessel, the wind carrying the scent of cold metal and dust, the valley watching without judgment. At the base of the ramp, officials waited, faces composed, eyes flicking briefly to him and lingering on her with measured curiosity. She stepped forward first, presenting the compiled records, the timelines, the testimony framed not as accusation but as account, and she felt the subtle shift as attention moved from the silent warrior to the speaking human who stood beside him. He remained quiet throughout, hands folded, gaze steady, his restraint sharper now, more visible against the formal setting. When questions came, they were directed to Evelyn, and she answered each one fully, refusing to embellish, refusing to soften the truth or sharpen it, trusting that clarity was its own defense. The officials conferred, low voices exchanged just out of earshot, and the wait stretched, each second marked by the hum of the vessel and the distant whisper of wind across the plain. Finally, one of them turned back, expression unreadable, and acknowledged the validity of the clause she had invoked, stating that a formal review would proceed, and that until then, the punishment of enforced silence would be suspended under observation. Evelyn felt her breath catch as she looked at him, and though he did not speak, the way his shoulders eased told her everything. As they walked back toward the station together, the vessel lifting behind them, she understood the risk she had taken was not just in challenging authority, but in choosing to stand where words mattered, and that sometimes the greatest danger was not the presence of power, but the moment when someone decided to answer it with quiet, unwavering resolve. The suspension of silence did not arrive as a declaration but as a permission, fragile and conditional, and the first sound he made was not a word but a breath, drawn carefully as if relearning the act, his chest rising and falling with measured control. Evelyn noticed it immediately, the subtle change in the room, the way the air itself seemed to pause in anticipation. He did not rush to speak. Instead, he closed his eyes and grounded himself, hands resting flat on the table, reminding himself that sound was now allowed but still dangerous. Outside, the patrol routes eased, the sensor arcs widening again, and the valley exhaled with them. That evening, they sat together in the low light, the auxiliary lamp casting long shadows, and Evelyn waited, giving him the same space she had always offered, understanding that some thresholds could not be crossed in a single step. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough and used, each word shaped slowly as if tested against memory. "My name is Kale," he said, and then paused, swallowing. "Kale Rhine." The sound of it carried weight, history compressed into syllables, and Evelyn felt an unexpected tightness in her throat. She nodded, accepting the name without ceremony, the way one accepted something precious by not making it spectacle. He continued only after a moment. "I was sworn to guard a bloodline," he said quietly, "but I chose to guard a life." He did not elaborate further, and she did not ask, because the meaning was clear enough. The days that followed were filled with waiting, the review process unfolding beyond their reach, messages arriving sporadically, requests for clarification, for confirmation, for patience. Kale spoke sparingly, conserving his voice, each sentence deliberate, as though he still feared losing it if he wasted it. Evelyn listened, not just to his words but to the cadence beneath them, the discipline that remained intact even as the punishment that had shaped it began to loosen. One afternoon, a formal communiqué arrived, its tone neutral but its implications profound, acknowledging the validity of the testimony and the exceptional circumstances of the broken oath, stating that while rank and title would not be restored, the sentence of enforced silence was lifted permanently. Kale read the message twice, then set it down carefully, his hands steady despite the significance of the moment. He looked at Evelyn, and this time there was no restraint in his expression, only quiet gratitude and something like disbelief. "You did not owe me this," he said softly. She met his gaze and shrugged. No one owed you silence either, she replied. That night, the sky cleared completely, stars sharp and bright, and they stood outside the station, the cool air settling around them. Cale tilted his head back, breathing freely, and for the first time since she had met him, he spoke without hesitation. I thought my honor was all I had left, he said. I did not realize how heavy it had become. Evelyn considered his words, then gestured toward the open gate, the lights glowing steady and warm. Honor should not weigh more than your voice, she said. He smiled faintly at that, a small expression but real, and as they walked back inside together, Evelyn understood that the oath he had broken had not destroyed him, but revealed the deeper law he had followed all along, one that valued life over power, and that sometimes redemption did not come with banners or crowns, but with the simple freedom to speak again in a place where silence had once been enforced. The valley did not change overnight, but something in it felt steadier, as if the land itself had accepted a new balance, and Evelyn noticed it in the way the sensors reported nothing remarkable, and yet felt more trustworthy than they ever had before. Cale remained, not as a guest waiting to leave, but as a presence that had chosen to stay, his armor packed away, his blade left untouched, his voice now part of the quiet rather than an absence within it. They settled into work without ceremony, repairing what age and weather had worn thin, reinforcing structures that had once been temporary and now felt permanent, and Evelyn realized that permanence did not come from walls or gates, but from shared intention. One morning, a final transmission arrived, brief and formal, confirming the conclusion of the review, stating that Cale Rhine was released from all residual penalties, free to travel, free to speak, free to live without observation. He read it once and set it aside, then looked out toward the open plain, considering the vastness he had once crossed in silence. I could leave, he said quietly, not as a declaration but an acknowledgement of possibility. Evelyn followed his gaze, the horizon wide and inviting. You could, she agreed. Or you could stay. He turned back to her, studying her face for any sign of expectation, finding none, and nodded slowly. I will stay, he said simply. And in that simplicity, she felt the final echo of a story larger than either of them settle into place. Time moved forward as it always did, measured in maintenance cycles and weather shifts, but now punctuated by conversation, by laughter that surprised them both when it surfaced, by long evenings spent under the stars where words were no longer rationed. Cale spoke of his past only when it mattered, never seeking absolution, never diminishing the choices he had made, and Evelyn listened, understanding that redemption was not a single moment granted by authority, but a daily practice shaped by how one chose to stand in the world. One night, as the sky reflected itself in the viewport glass, stars layered upon stars, Evelyn watched Cale pause, eyes tracing the constellations, and she realized that the silence that had once defined him had transformed, no longer a punishment, but a reminder of restraint freely chosen. I was called the Silent Wolf, he said, a hint of wry amusement in his tone. I thought it was an insult. She smiled faintly. Wolves listen, she replied. That is how they survive. He considered that, then nodded, accepting the truth in it. The gate remained open more often than closed after that, not because danger had vanished, but because fear no longer dictated the shape of their lives, and travelers occasionally passed through, finding shelter, finding warmth, finding a quiet example of coexistence they did not expect at the edge of nowhere. Evelyn would watch Cale speak to them, calm and measured, his voice carrying the weight of experience without bitterness, and she understood then what his silence had truly cost and what his voice now represented. In a galaxy ruled by power and enforced obedience, he had broken a royal oath to protect a life, and a human had opened a gate without asking for credentials or promises, and together they had proven that honor did not belong to crowns or laws alone. It lived in choices made quietly, in gates opened when they could have stayed shut, and in the courage to speak when silence was easier, leaving behind a truth that did not need proclamation to endure.